Robservations with Meyer Burnett.
Patience was once a virtue. Not anymore. In today's world of instant gratification, patience is no longer valued. And in Hollywood, where billion-dollar grossing films are now the norm and immediate profits are championed by executives, patience is all but dead. This is especially true when dealing with how to develop a modern movie franchise. When Disney purchased the rights to Star Wars in 2012, the news was met with intense excitement. The news only got better for Star Wars fans when it was revealed George Lucas would not be a part of the creative duties of the new era of Disney Star Wars films. Rightly or wrongly, fans had labeled Lucas and his unrestrained filmmaking as the reason why the much-maligned prequel trilogy didn't live up to expectations and was a shadow of the original trilogy. No longer the singular vision of one man, Star Wars was now under the control of a multimedia empire. Disney would surely take their time constructing a new sequel trilogy with a coherent storyline conceived by the best writers in the business and directed by a visionary auteur. Who was that? No, I'm just kidding. Not really. Well, we hoped that's what they would do. Instead, what we got was a reverse, apparently too much wine. Instead, what we got was a reverse-engineered franchise where release dates for films were staked in advance without a mapped-out narrative to meet those self-imposed deadlines. Watching the resulting sequel trilogy, any astute viewer could discern they were making up the story as they went along. Each film had a different director and different sets of writers. With that came conflicting visions of what this new Star Wars trilogy should be. When Colin Trevorrow, who was tapped to direct the final installment, left the project, J.J. Abrams, director of the first entry, swooped in at the last minute to clean up the narrative mess. But it was too little, too late. Over the course of the trilogy, characters were introduced and then diminished or forgotten, subplots were truncated or tossed out altogether, and main plot lines turned into plot holes. The Star Wars saga was always George Lucas's original idea. Instead of following Lucas's notes, which were decades in the making, the new creatives charted their own path and got lost. Not a rudderless ship, but a ship with too many rudders meandering around. The damage to the Star Wars brand was swift, and fan backlash was vitriolic. Whereas the prequel trilogy had narrative flaws, the elements that made Star Wars endearing were still there. If the prequel trilogy served as a cautionary tale for how narrative flaws can diminish a franchise, the sequel trilogy became a cautionary tale for how lack of narrative can damage a franchise almost irreparably. But how do we get to this point? How was it that in a Hollywood post-Lord of the Rings trilogy, where a franchise was painstakingly planned and revised in several years of grueling pre-production before a single frame was shot, eventually going on to make billions and winning countless accolades, could such an iconic franchise like Star Wars become so bungled and haphazardly made? The issue wasn't with Star Wars. The issue was with how movie franchises are currently constructed. Instead of planning things in advance and creating an overarching story, studios are now making these franchises up as they go along, or worse, trying to emulate winning formulas of established and totally unrelated franchises just to generate box office success and meet corporate expectations. Release dates are now planted years in advance to stake out that too-important opening weekend, and films are fast-tracked or rushed into production as a result, oftentimes resulting in feverish productions to meet unrealistic deadlines. This all amounts to a reverse engineering of franchises. However, the problem runs deeper than the wrong creative minds being in charge of a franchise. In this day and age of movie studios being subsidiaries of larger conglomerates, the art of movie making and meticulous pre-production has been supplanted by spreadsheets that need to make quarterly projections. Nothing is guaranteed when making the first film of a hopeful franchise, but to put the franchise before the story is a greater mistake. The Burnett axiom: never put your universe before your characters or your stories. Never put your franchise before each movie. For studios to be solely reliant upon the popularity of the franchise material to generate revenue, regardless of film quality, is a dire mistake that can alienate the fan base and end up killing a franchise. One only has to look at the immense failure of Universal Studios' attempt at reviving their roster of classic movie monsters into their own cinematic universe. The Dark Universe. I would say that actually they had a pretty good idea. They just bet on the wrong creative team. Tom Cruise was cast in The Mummy alongside Russell Crowe's Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. That wasn't the mistake they made. Johnny Depp was cast as a titular invisible man in his own franchise, and Javier Bardem was cast as Frankenstein's monster, with Angelina Jolie long rumored to be his bride in a revival of the Frankenstein franchise. By the way, all of that was great. Great. Press release and a teaser image of the cast were released, ushering in what Universal thought would be the next great cinematic universe in the manner of the multi-billion-dollar Marvel Cinematic Universe, emphasis on the multi-billion-dollar part. Universal's plans were ambitious, but it was all too fast, too soon, with Universal putting the Dark Universe's intentions before the story. I know. The first film of the Dark Universe, Tom Cruise's The Mummy, was an all-out failure, bombing at the box office and with critics and fans alike. Almost overnight, all announced plans for Universal's Dark Universe were put on indefinite hold or scrapped altogether. Just like that, the Dark Universe was one and done, crashing down to Earth in a monumental thud. The situation would definitely have been different had Universal focused on making The Mummy a good film rather than get caught up in the prospects of the cinematic universe it was supposed to launch. Well, let me just be clear here. Everyone who's working on a movie, from the studio level on down, is genuinely trying to make that movie the best movie it can be. The problem now is that so much money is involved with all of these movies, is that singular voices who are controlling everything are few and far between. Now there's multiple levels of fear, really. It's all fear-based because these decisions have so much monetary ramifications that if you fuck up once, there's a ton of money that will be lost, which is what's happened. It's all fear-based and no one can fuck up. And by the way, it's amazing to me that any, say, $150 or $200 million movie could be fucked up because it's not rocket science. It isn't rocket science, but yet everyone gets in their own way. In today's world of billion-dollar franchises and cinematic universes, studios are eager to cross the finish line without running the marathon. That is true. The only studio to employ any kind of lessons learned from Lord of the Rings is Marvel, run by Kevin Feige and purchased by Disney in 2009. Working on a slew of Marvel film adaptations by various studios in the aughts, as I always say, Feige was able to leech from each production what worked and what didn't. I wouldn't say leech, I would say glean from each production what worked and what didn't, honing his sensibilities as a producer and as a storyteller. It wasn't until 2006, when Marvel Studios was launched, an independent studio focusing on film adaptations of Marvel Comics B and C level superheroes, that Feige was able to start the slow burn of franchise building. Devising multiple franchises that create a wider cinematic universe is something that only Marvel has mastered, at least so far. Their franchise building techniques stem primarily from the organic narrative codependency and intricate plotting found in the comic books they adapt. Plotting a narrative, interweaving stories, planting the seeds for future stories, even a minor cameo, everything is expertly planned years in advance by Feige, the buck stopping with him. Also want to point out Louis D'Esposito and Victoria Alonso are part of that core team, with each of the Marvel Studios films averaging a global worldwide gross of $1 billion. Feige has cemented himself as Hollywood's most successful producer, possibly ever. Not possibly, he is. What he has created is the new era and standard of how Hollywood movie franchises should be viewed and produced by studios. Take notes, Hollywood. It's rather ironic that Peter Jackson, the man who directed the iconic Lord of the Rings trilogy, the original gold standard of how a franchise should be crafted from pre-production to release, would become a victim of Hollywood's current state of affairs. When it was announced that The Hobbit, a prequel to The Lord of the Rings, would be adapted into 2 films, with Jackson serving as producer and co-writer and Guillermo del Toro as director, this new franchise was once again sent to reprise the greatness of its predecessor. But with nearly 2 years of pre-production completed, Del Toro left the project, his vision negated by Jackson, who stepped in to take over the franchise at the last minute. With release dates needing to be met, there was no time to waste, and Jackson had to reluctantly hit the ground running. The now 2-film franchise was expanded to 3 films, further exacerbating production. The Hobbit trilogy suffered the same fate as the Star Wars sequels and failed to live up to the lofty expectations set by Jackson's Lord of the Rings trilogy. Fans and critics soured on the Hobbit franchise. Au contraire, though, the Hobbit franchise. Let's do a quick look, shall we? Let's see just how much the Hobbit movies made. Why don't we? So, The Hobbit: An Unexpected Journey, the first movie in the franchise, grossed $1,017,368. The Hobbit: An Unexpected Journey crossed $1 billion. The Desolation of Smaug, let's see how that did. That made a little less money, but it still made $958,366,855. And The Hobbit: The Battle of the Five Armies grossed $956,019,788. So while not crossing $1 billion, they came close. So collectively, the 3 Hobbit movies still remain one of the most successful trilogies monetarily ever made. So from a studio perspective, Peter Jackson also won. You might not have had the critics' accolades or the fans, but the ever popular box office numbers as far as the studios go, The Hobbit did quite well and was certainly not at all a disappointment. Jackson would lament years later that he began the Hobbit franchise woefully unprepared. Quote, because Guillermo del Toro had to leave and I jumped in and took over, we didn't wind the clock back a year and a half to give me a year and a half of prep to design the movie, which was different to what he was doing, Jackson admitted. It was impossible, and as a result of it being impossible, I just started shooting the movie with most of it not prepped at all. You're going on set and you're winging it. You've got these massively complicated scenes, no storyboards, and you're making it up there and then on the spot. And I hadn't got the entire scripts written to our satisfaction, so that was a very high-pressure situation. I think that's legitimate. It shows in the final films. And I don't mean to denigrate what you're saying here, because I think you're correct. But I just wanted to remind everyone that as far as Hollywood is concerned, these movies, while maybe not as creatively satisfying as the Lord of the Rings films, and I would say, how could they be? Because the story was not apocalyptic in nature. It was based on a smaller story, so it never was going to be that satisfying. But the fact that they got 3 Hobbit movies and they all crossed, well, one crossed $1 billion and the other 2 made over $900.5 million. Epic win for everyone involved. Much has changed since Jackson began work on the Lord of the Rings franchise back in the 1990s. It's evident that executives with filmmaking sensibilities don't run the studios anymore. If they did, understanding of the production process, especially when dealing with high-stakes franchise material, would be appreciated. This shift in mentality is the difference between the Lord of the Rings and the Hobbit trilogies, the original Star Wars trilogy and the sequel trilogy, and the failed Dark Universe and the thriving Marvel Cinematic Universe. Movie studios are now owned by conglomerates that care about the bottom line. Gone are the days where movie franchises were made by a filmmaker with a singular vision. Here are the days when franchises are made by a committee, and with major studios looking for the next great franchise, filmmakers with less grandiose sensibilities have left the studio system and have been embraced by streaming services that are in need of content. The need to meet corporate expectations to come up with the next big money-making franchise is the wrong approach to have when dealing with a film slate. But this isn't going to stop Hollywood. Their need for franchise fare and shared cinematic universes has only grown in recent years, thanks solely to Marvel Studios' success. In 2018, Sony launched their Sony Pictures Universe of Marvel Characters, or SPUMP. Really? They couldn't have come up with a better acronym? With Venom and their Valiant Comics cinematic universe in 2020 with Bloodshot, Paramount is going for broke with their multi-platform expansion of their Star Trek and Transformers franchises, the former used as bait to rein in subscribers to Paramount's dwindling CBS All Access streaming service, which, by the way, is gone, as we've seen those Super Bowl ads with Patrick Stewart on the top of the Paramount Mountain. Paramount Plus is coming, ladies and gentlemen. Woohoo! Warner Brothers has their DC cinematic universe churning out movies that are hit or miss, and Star Wars and Lord of the Rings are on the rebound, focusing primarily on streaming content. Time will tell if these attempts at padding a film slate and saturating the market with franchise fare will generate the profits executives and shareholders hope to reap, and more importantly, produce content audiences want to see. But the key to a successful franchise will always remain the same. Never, ever put the franchise before the story, which is the Burnett axiom. And I want to thank you very much, Ash, for writing this letter. A lot of it I agree with. First of all, if I may opine, I think that Hollywood is a microcosm of the problem that we have, well, maybe call it in the West, maybe everywhere, in that we want the most amount of money in the fastest way possible. And this idea of, like, when Lord of the Rings was started, and I'll tell this story yet again, one of my favorite stories maybe ever in Hollywood history is that originally Miramax was going to make the Lord of the Rings movies, and they were going to make 2 films. And Peter Jackson and his wizards, Richard Taylor, everyone in New Zealand, Weta, that had been being built up by Peter since he was making movies, like Bad Taste and Meet the Feebles and all the way through Heavenly Creatures. And the movies that he was making in New Zealand, he was building a cadre of people around him that were learning their craft as they went along. And so what they had done is when they were making Lord of the Rings, they were going to do it the same way. It was going to be the biggest thing they'd ever done. And all of these great craftspeople were working diligently on making Lord of the Rings a reality when they were working with Miramax. And for whatever reason, Miramax balked. They got cold feet. So Miramax basically, and again, this is an oversimplification, but Miramax basically said, okay, well, we're willing to give up the Lord of the Rings, but you're basically going to have somebody pay us $50 million, pay us off, and then they can take over the prospect, the franchise or whatever. So Peter Jackson came with a 5-minute reel showing all the work that had been done, everything how are they going to make this movie, basically. And he showed it to everybody. He was pounding the pavement. He was walking blocks in New York, meeting after meeting, depressed, trying to figure out how I don't want to lay off my crew in New Zealand. I want everyone to work. I want them all to. We have very talented people. The Kiwis we're there. We're going to use duct tape and baling wire, and we're going to make the greatest franchise ever made. He knew, Peter Jackson knew that and by the way, he's right. He knew that he had the team that could do this, pull it off. But now he had to find somebody. Miramax pulled out. Now, he had known Bob Shaye, head of New Line, for a long time. Bob Shaye was not unaware of Peter Jackson. Peter Jackson had made The Frighteners. People knew who he was. The last meeting Peter Jackson had before he was going to go with his tail tucked between his legs back to New Zealand and pull the plug was with Bob Shaye. So Peter took in his tape, his 5 minutes to show Bob Shaye, here's what we're doing. Probably on DVD by then, but anyway, he took the sizzle reel, everything that was going on, and he's like, we're making these 2 movies. We were going to do them for Miramax, now we're going to do them for someone else. Lights go down, Peter shows Bob Shaye the reel, lights come up, Bob Shaye looks at Peter and goes, wait a minute, aren't there 3 Lord of the Rings movies? And for whatever reason, and the one thing that we never got to do when we were working on the Lord of the Rings special features was I wanted actually to do the interview. I didn't do very many interviews on Fellowship. I interviewed people like Andrew Lesnie, and I was able to interview John Rhys Davies. It wasn't until Two Towers, because I was working on the Tron documentary, but Two Towers I did a lot. Hundreds and hundreds of hours of interviews with the cast and crew of Lord of the Rings. But I wanted to interview Bob Shaye because I wanted to ask him the one question. What did you see in Peter Jackson's, other than Peter Jackson's enthusiasm? You already knew he was a great filmmaker, but what convinced you to literally bet your entire company that you'd spent 2 previous decades building up? You'd had the Nightmare on Elm Street franchise, you'd done the Rush Hour, whatever. You had built New Line into a player, and that was what you'd done, and you were willing to bet the farm on Lord of the Rings, and he did. He did. He rolled those dice. He was Dr. Dealgood from Beyond Thunderdome. Dice are rolling. break the wheel or make a deal, whatever it was. I like Dr. Dealgood. I like Beyond Thunderdome. But anyway, so he did it. Made it happen. Probably the biggest risk ever taken in Hollywood history, at least at one time. Why don't we make all 3 movies at once? Yeah. I mean, and that was not an easy proposition. For those who have watched the special features on the Lord of the Rings discs, you know that those movies were very iterative. They were working on those movies up. If Peter Jackson could wait until literally the last 10 seconds, he would. He would take that. And by the way, he was right to do so because he put his heart and soul into those movies, as did everyone who worked on them. But you had a visionary like Peter Jackson, and not to be downplayed, but you had Richard Taylor over at Weta, who also, I mean, to go into that place, and I was lucky, I was there many times working on both Lord of the Rings, and I went back there and interviewed Richard for Chronicles of Narnia. To be there, I even went in the secret room, and I saw my friend Christian Gossett was working in the secret room at Weta Digital. I'm like, dude, what are you doing here? It was amazing. He was like, hey, Rob, what's up? I'm like, how do I know somebody in New Zealand working in a secret room that Richard Taylor... Anyways, it was amazing. Amazing. But here's the thing. Our society wants, because of the way our capitalist society is developed, I want more money for my next fiscal quarter. And the problem with capitalism, which I'm a firm believer in, but it's been bastardized. It's been bastardized across the entire world. We want too much profit all at once. And the fact is, we've forgotten what the foundation of business. You want strong foundational, I mean, all the shenanigans that happen with the stock market and all that. What we need to get back to, in terms of capitalism, the foundational principles of building a business. Shore up your business. Make it strong. And I know the Hollywood studios who are beholden to their larger corporate minders, we want more money now. What can we want to be doing we want to be doing what Marvel's doing, but they don't want to do the work. Yeah, we just want their profits. And that's like there's the West. There's the entire capitalist system. We want those profits. Well, what you need is a visionary like Kevin Feige, and you work up to it. You shore up your defenses, your franchise, whatever. You work hard, and you make it work because you know what you're doing. And with franchises, if you want to build a franchise, here's how you build a franchise. You want to know how you build a franchise? Here's how you build a franchise. You make one great movie that people love. Don't plan. Lord of the Rings, you had a book. You had a blueprint. You had 3 books. It's like, okay, this was an anomaly. But if you're going to make a great franchise, now, if you're Disney and you know you're going to make multiple Star Wars movies, even then, don't try and plan. And I have to say, there was a lot more planning. By the way, it has become a fallacy that there wasn't planning involved in the 3 Disney Star Wars sequel films. As you might know, because I was the very first channel on YouTube or anywhere to review Colin Trevorrow's Duel of the Fates script, there was a plan in place. They had a plan, but there were certain things that happened. Oh, like Carrie Fisher's death. That was a big deal. There was monkey wrenches thrown into the works. But here's how you here's a Burnett axiom. You want to start a franchise? Make something great to begin with. Don't worry about movies 2 and 3 and 4 and 10 and 45. Make the best movie you can to launch out of the gate. Earn your franchise. The only way that you are going to ever have an ongoing successful franchise is if you earn it. And how do you earn it? By making an incredibly fulfilling film that gives the audience everything they want. Then, once you've earned that, once you've won them over by making a great film, they'll come back. And that's how you build a franchise. Don't start out, unless you're going to adapt 3 books all at once, like, I don't know, Dune, maybe? Could have done Dune. I mean, Dune, you're not even getting the first book. You're getting half the book. But as I was demonetized for reporting on, I reviewed the Dune script, and Warner Brothers demonetized me. It's fucking great. It's going to be great. If you're a Dune fan, big fan of what they did. But boy, if I was in charge of Dune at Warner Brothers, I would amortize the costs, and I would have made Dune. I would have made Dune Messiah, and I would have made Children of Dune. Now we're going to get Dune, then we're going to get Dune Prophet, and then we're going to get Dune Messiah. Or, pardon me. Yeah, that's right. Dune Prophet, Dune Messiah. That's what they want to do. They want to tell the Paul Atreides story, which, by the way, for those of you who don't know, it does not end well, but it's awesome. So that's the plan that Warner Brothers in the back of their minds. But got to give it up to them. While I think of all the projects they could have done 3 Dune movies and put them that way, pitch them that way or whatever. But instead, they're hedging their bets. It's so funny to me because the one thing that you could do, you could plan your franchise and make 3 movies at once because it would have been easier, especially the first book, is make 3 Dune movies all at one time. That's what I would have done. I would have bet the farm on that one. But no, they ended up making the first half of the first book. So maybe we'll get half a Dune. By the way, the script is excellent. But anyway, where am I? I don't even know. I'm just going to say that the problem is we live in a world now where the corporations as they exist, the shareholders, the whole ecosystem that we have here in the West in our corporate-minded society is no longer geared toward long-term stability. It's all about how much can I make for the next fiscal quarter. And that is not a way to build a great foundation. And the thing is, when they expect the studios to be magical, and every time they are going to make a $200 million movie, there's so many cooks and so many people that get to weigh in, because at the end of the day, you have to appease your corporate base and your shareholders and all that. That is no way to plan long term. You want to build a franchise, you've got to plan long term, and you can't expect, you have to be like, you know what? We will see the fruits of our labor yield results maybe 2 or 3 years from now, not in the next fiscal quarter. But, that's problematic. Anyway, a great letter. I loved that letter. That was a great letter and very, very well written, if I do say so myself.